Welcome to Presence, a global conversation for a new earth, with hosts Doug King and Cody Deese.
Thank you very much and welcome everyone. Glad to have you with us here on this February day from wherever in the world you are. For those on the other side of the world, like our board chairman, Robert Costa, I hope you're enjoying your fall as you are getting ready to, you're headed toward winter, Robert, and we are headed toward spring and summer.
Well, Doug, we actually had snow here in Atlanta.
Yeah, we got 2 inches here at the Presence compound.
Wow. We did not get that.
Yeah.
Of course, it happened. I slept in that day because I had the one day to sleep in. So I kind of missed the whole thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But we did that. I overcame the urge to go out and make snow angels and just stayed in here and watched it. Enjoyed it.
Well, we got to get to business, Doug.
Time to roll.
Yep. Now, before we get into, we are people of the world, we are attempting to land the plane. And when I say attempting, I mean, don't hold us to it.
Right.
Who knows? You know what I mean? And here's the thing. No one's in a hurry here.
No.
I know you're probably listening to this driving and you're blowing horns and you're moving around people and you want people out of the fast lane that's driving slow. And I get we're all in a hurry to die. I understand that.
Yeah.
But we're not in a hurry here.
No.
We're kind of chill.
We are.
We're laid back. And whatever happens, happens.
Because there's always going to be something.
Sure.
You never wake up and go, well, I took care of that and don't have anything now the rest of my life.
Exactly. So that said, before we get into the descent and trying to land this plane,
right,
I wanted to make our listeners aware that we're going to be moving on to a few different series down the road on this podcast. I've got a lot of ideas in my head that I've been chewing on, and you're like, well, let's go after them. So that's what we're going to do. Now, one of those is I would love to do an episode or two on the listeners' questions.
Yes.
So many of you already send us questions, which we love. Mm-hmm. But I would love to take a couple episodes and just work through the questions that the listeners are sending us. Yeah. Because already they're sending us some really good ones. So here's my call is for all of you listeners that are out there, do us a favor, whatever it is that we've been saying that you are, could be something that you're stumped about or you're still wrestling with, or whatever area that you find, man, there's some confusion here or some gray here that I'm not sure about.
Right.
Man, articulate it the best you can and send us those questions. Yeah. You can send them to info@presence.tv. That's it. And honestly, for some of you that are like, you love mental gymnastics and you think you've got all of this just like nailed, we'll like push back. Like we want to hear it and show us where, you're seeing things that you think perhaps we might not be seeing. Yeah. So I want everyone to be a part of that. And I'd love to spend an episode or two just working through some of those questions.
That sounds great.
All right.
Excellent. Love it.
Excellent. Now today, let's get into Romans 11 again. So, if by random chance you started at this episode, which is like part 19, right, which I don't know why you'd start here, but let's just say you did. We're working through your dad's book, Irrevocable. Mm-hmm. And we've been now for a while working through Romans 9, 10, and now we're at 11. And I want to get into attempting to descend the plane at Romans 11 because honestly, it ends. Man, there's so much. The word "all" is used so many times. Mercy is used so many times. The doxology at the end, the whole thing is just this euphoric, just anthem of just gloriousness. Yes, and I want to get into that, but we should talk about the remnant because that's mentioned. Yep. And then this whole thing about first fruits as well. Yeah. So where do you want to kick off today?
Well, maybe the first thing I think of when I'm looking at this whole 9 through 11 is a constant reminder that when I move into chapter 11, Paul is now addressing everything he said in the previous 2 chapters. So first and foremost, look, we just read chapter 10 that a lot of people say they have problems with in terms of a universal God, because Paul is saying it's with your mouth and your lips that you make confession and you believe in your heart. And he's literally outlining all through chapter 10 what unbelieving Israel has absolutely not done, which is the reason why the Gentiles have concluded that they are lost. It's the same reason that Christianity has been preaching this message for 2,000 years, and that is, unless you do all the things, as Paul just outlined, then you are certainly going to be lost. And yet, if we move into chapter 11, Paul's question, after he goes through all of this, is, I say then, has God cast away his people? Certainly not. And so this is the very opposite of what we would have expected. We would have expected Paul to say, yes, because I just outlined it in chapter 10. Unbelieving Israel hasn't done any of this. So what Paul is going to do in chapter 11, he's going to try to correct the Gentiles' misunderstanding about their role and function in this God process. The Gentiles were misunderstanding who they were and what the body of Christ was and what it was to be for. And that was, of course, Paul's concern then. And we're addressing it now from this perspective 2,000 years later to say that the very problems that Paul was writing about are the very problems that we're discussing here in these podcasts.
I'm
good?
Sorry.
Okay.
You have to understand for our listeners. Our listeners,
yeah.
We've been talking for probably almost two hours already.
We have.
So you have to understand we're coming
sober.
Into this hot and heavy. Yeah,
we're sober. These men are not drunk, as it is the whatever hour of the day.
Not. I mean, I wouldn't mind being, but I'm not. Yeah. Anyways,
this is like Pentecost. We're not drunk.
Okay. Without painting with a very broad brush here, because we know there's nuance here, right? When we read Romans 11. So, but the idea here is what you talk about with these Gentiles that Paul, like the entire letter, seems to be Paul attempting to correct their misunderstanding.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
And it's an understanding that was making what God was doing in Christ a new world religion.
Yes. And coming up with a new way of putting up a wall. This is what's interesting. Paul's already gone through this with the people, the Gentile followers in Ephesus, right? Because he makes a point to the people in Ephesus that Jesus has torn down the wall of hostility between Jew and Gentile. The work of God through Christ was to take down walls and boundaries with regard to identity. Before Christ, Jew was an identity. Gentile was an identity. Male was an identity. Female was an identity. Slave, free. Those were identities. They all create a wall between those types of comparisons. So Jew compared to Gentile, there's a wall there that defines who is or who isn't on this or that side of the wall. Once you put up a wall, what's going to happen? You're going to get the hostility. We might, I don't know if anyone's ever heard of this, but in our political system, it was mentioned that our country might put up a wall. If people are not aware of that. And when that thought of putting up a wall came into being, a great deal of hostility was brought from so many different people.
Okay. For our listeners that don't know, and I know that you know this, but I just got back from that wall.
Yeah, you did. That's right. That's right. You went down there.
I took a trip down to the U.S.-Mexico border and spent a week down there. And just honestly, I tried to go with a posture of a non-judgmental spirit. Mm-hmm. And I just wanted to listen because, you know, the thing is, like, you hear all this stuff on like the media and you never know like what's true, what's not true, what agendas are behind what's being said, all that kind of stuff. So it's like, I want to go down there and just meet some of these people. And it was organized in a very professional way. And we met a lot of great people. But there was a day where they took us to one portion of the wall. And so this wall, this border wall, just for those that don't know, that aren't familiar with like the U.S., they have plans, and it's in motion, just so you know. So they are building an actual wall. It's like rebar coming out of concrete from the edge of Texas, like Brownsville, all the way where the coast is, all the way up through San Diego. So that's a long ways. This wall estimates are somewhere around $21.6 billion to build. And it's interesting because I met people who this wall is actually, they're having to knock down their church and their homes. And so it's not just going out in open areas. It's like cutting through different. And I sat there, Doug, and I tried to suspend all judgment. And I just looked at that wall and I thought this verse did come in my mind. And I think it's in Ephesians.
It is. I think it's around 4 where Paul says that's 3 or 4 somewhere in there.
The wall of hostility.
Yes.
And I thought about how much of the problem here is our attachments to all of our labels.
Yeah.
So it was almost like this is what I kept hearing. And hang with me because I want to bridge this to what I feel like. I don't want to stretch it too far from the Jew Gentile mark, but it's we're Americans. This is our country, and we need to protect ourselves from, and there was another label on the other side, these Guatemalans or these Mexicans, so it's almost like this nationalism, this identity of I'm attached to, this is who I am. And then there was also like a projection as well of like, if you're not careful, you begin to hear these people are dangerous and evil, and we're on God's side. You know what I mean?
Sure.
And I couldn't help but to think about Romans.
Right.
And I'm like, that may not be that far off the mark.
Well, it's human nature. And so human nature is never far off the mark because we're all part of human nature. And this idea of hostility coming from boundaries is when those boundaries are used with regard to identity. And that's why I bring up Jew was identity, Gentile, male, female. Those were identities that meant something in those societies.
Because that's an ethnicity and a gender.
It is.
Yes.
And those were identities to those people. And this is the other side of the coin. And that is that Paul was not saying that from this point forward, there's not going to be men and women. Paul wasn't saying from this point on, there's not going to be Jews and Gentiles. What Paul was saying was identity, God identity transcends those things. And so the wall that was taken down was with regard to identity. Now, how many times have we brought this up, the difference between identity and role and function?
Okay,
Cody?
pause.
Okay. Okay.
Because I want to get into this because I think when we use language like universal God identity, one of the pushbacks that I have from good friends that I admire is they say, you need to be very careful as a white male. All right. Now hear that language as a white male, because language like universal God identity has been used to perpetuate oppressive systems. And what they say is, when you use language like universal God identity, you are erasing. There's an erasure of Black culture or Native American culture or the disabled, or on and on the list goes. Doug, how do we hold what we believe Paul is doing here of expressing the wall of hostility being removed and that there is no longer Jew and Gentile, and at the same time not erasing the Jew and Gentile? Does that make sense?
Of course it does. And this is why it's so important to understand that gender is a function. It's a biological function, a ethnicity, whatever it is that we want to take where there's generally some hostility between two groups of people is having to do with the role and function of one dominating or manipulating the other group. Causing pain and suffering to the other group, taking advantage of, etc. But when you're coming to God identity, what Paul is saying is that if we first start by recognizing that the human value equation is the same for everyone on the planet, there isn't any more than, less than. That's what Paul's saying. There isn't any more than, less than. The wall of hostility comes from that, because the more thans have some way of oppressing the less thans, and that's why they're less. And what Paul is saying is that if we start with a human value equation that says we are all the same, we are all children of God, we are all children of love, and that we all have the same value, there is no more than, there is no less than. That's when Paul is discussing God identity. The other hand is, Paul is not saying that I'm no longer a male in relation to my wife, Danae, who's a female. We both recognize that we are male and female. And in fact, there are perspectives that she has that I don't have, and vice versa. And there's tons of books out there. I mean, you talk about love languages or male perspectives and female perspectives. The same is true of cultural perspectives. And so Paul is not trying to eliminate anybody's ethnicity or culture. What Paul is trying to say is, let's don't get caught in the quicksand of cultural arguments over identity and who has the right to say what. Paul is saying, can we not transcend above that? Can we not go to a place where we're instead focusing on the way we are all the same?
I was even thinking about, in this context, these Gentiles, how even hearing this language, well, let's just go there for a minute, it can come across anti-Semitic. Okay. Now, we just spent 2 hours in this conversation, so I don't want to unravel it. And we will do some podcasts down the road on it.
Yep.
But in large part, sometimes you can look at these teachings of Paul and even what these Gentiles are doing in this moment, and it can come across like these Jews, unbelieving Jews, are stuck in their law.
Yep.
They're, it's all about works. They're in bondage.
Yep.
But the Gentiles, now these are the saviors of the world. Now they've come along and they have presented a Jesus that's here to save all these unbelieving Jews out of that terrible, awful religion.
Right.
And that alone, I don't think Christians, and I put quotes around that, realize how anti-Semitic that language and that paradigm can actually be. And this is where I think that differentiates what we believe Paul is saying.
Absolutely.
When we talk about an integral perspective.
And that's why we're using the model of spiral dynamics, is because it helps us to understand exactly what Paul is saying and why you can have these various levels on the one hand, or different groups on the one hand, in terms of roles and functions and places in life that someone might be with their faith or lack thereof. And yet, on the other hand, re-emphasize to all of us that we're all in the soup together, we're all in the struggle together, and that we all come from the same Creator and therefore have the same identity and equality in every single one of us. And so, yes, Paul is looking at this to the Gentile audience and saying, you are putting another wall up, and the wall you're putting up is saved, lost, heaven and hell, whatever. In their case, it was specifically Paul saying all Israel will be saved, and you're saying no. You're saying they're cast away. They're rejected. Paul's saying no, they're not rejected. They're accepted. So this is the wall that's being put up, and it's on. And what's it on the basis of? It's on the basis of the Gentiles saying the grace of God only covers the people on this planet that do what I do, that believe what I believe.
I think we need to pause right there.
Okay.
Say that one more time.
The Gentiles were saying, they were creating a wall that said, the grace of God can't go past this wall. What wall? The wall that we put up that says, this is my faith, my belief, and this is as far as the grace of God goes, and God's power has no ability to go beyond what wall I put up by defining my faith, my belief, and confessing with my lips, and so on and so forth. And so Paul is saying, you Gentiles are putting up another wall, just like there was a wall before in ethnicity, Jew and Gentile. You've now put up a new wall that has to do with your level of acceptance or rejection of what God is trying to do through Christ. And the point Paul is trying to make is that when you set that wall up, you have just done the very same thing that Jesus came to deliver everyone from, and that is you have attached to a form and you've decided who's in the form and who isn't.
I was thinking about how quickly the Gentiles have become the center.
Yes. Yeah.
So think about the Gentiles at this point now are saying who's in and who's out.
Yes.
When actually they're the ones graciously included.
Yes. And that's the point Paul made. Paul said, as a matter of fact, the other thing that Paul is bringing up here, I think I knocked my mic down there. The other thing Paul is bringing up here is that the Gentiles and Jews were exclusionary to begin with, and now the Gentiles are just making the exclusion boundaries on a different set of requirements. But they have nonetheless set up a new group of requirements, if you will.
Yeah, I just think it's interesting that a lot of what we're talking about here in Romans 9, 10, and 11 is exactly what is still like transpiring today. And we haven't seemed to it feels like it's as the Gentiles missed it in the moment, so it seems like we're missing it today.
Yeah.
And this is what has transpired, right? I mean, we are now like, okay, well, as Gentiles, let's just form this new religion, and we inevitably continually do the same thing. And I love what you said. It's almost like we've underestimated the immensity of God. Yeah, because we're as you said. Yeah. Well, your power can only go so far.
Exactly. And it's as far as my faith or my belief. And then
That's strong.
When you go down there, then what's the next thing we have to determine? Well, does Joe and Bob and Mary and Sue have faith? Do they really believe? Did they get baptized or not baptized? Did they confess or not? Did they remain faithful? Did they not remain faithful? And so what do you end up with? 30,000 opinions of what it means to be saved. 30,000 opinions of the way in which one is saved. And so you will constantly have wall after wall after wall that's built up as a wall of hostility and a boundary between people who can't get along or worship in the same building. And the reason they can't do that is because they have set themselves up as the determination of what is exclusively God identity. And that's why Paul uses the word all constantly. Mm-hmm. He's trying to transcend the human ego that wants so badly to claim, I got it right, I have it right, and that is what's necessary to have God identity, is what I have done correctly. Otherwise, you don't have no God identity for you.
Okay. In the remaining time that we have, let's talk about these two symbols in chapter 11, the remnant and first fruits.
Yeah.
Okay. What does Paul mean when he's talking about this remnant?
Yeah. So first of all, he brings up, I think, a great example of Elijah in the back in the Hebrew writings of when Elijah was on the run from Jezebel. Mm-hmm. Because he had been up against the prophets of Baal, who she represented, the false gods, etc. And once he had a great victory on Mount Carmel over these guys, and everything went his way, I won't get into all the details, Jezebel became furious, and she pursued him, and she was trying to take his life. And he sits down under a broom tree, and he's singing, "Woe is me." Oh my gosh, the whole world's going to hell in a handbasket, God, and I'm the only one who seems to get it right. This is what Paul's saying to the Gentiles. You guys are sitting around just like Elijah, singing the same song. Oh my God, we're the only ones that have gotten it right. Only one. This is where God introduces the idea of a remnant. And the idea of a remnant is that it is to preserve the whole. That the remnant, God is saying to Elijah, is that there are others, not just Elijah, but there's a whole remnant of people throughout Israel who are still adhering to God versus idols, and that because of that remnant, all Israel will be preserved, all 12 tribes. And even those who were not believing, understanding, and avoiding idols like Elijah was, the remnant and Elijah was part of that remnant, was going to save the entire nation. So the important thing here, Cody, is with remnant, it's a transform word. And I go back to the fact that in previous podcasts, you want to take a look at the podcast where we've talked about moving from form to transform to formless. Remnant is a transform word. The purpose of the remnant in God's work was not that the remnant would stay a remnant through history. The purpose of a remnant was transformative in that it was to preserve the whole, to keep the whole together. And this is what the Gentiles were not understanding. They were part of a body of Christ that was transformed. That body of Christ was to be a remnant on behalf of the whole, all nations. Eventually, all nations would walk in the light of this new heaven and earth and new Jerusalem. And they were the remnant that were modeling the basis of how it worked, what the nature of the new heaven and earth was. So that was the point that Paul's trying to make to them. Look, a remnant, you guys, the remnant was not in and of itself, and you're making your remnant work a thing in and of itself by saying everybody else is excluded, and you're not doing it on behalf of all others.
So it seems there's like a contradiction of inclusion here.
Absolutely, yes.
And it's like we speak inclusion, but at some levels, we're not really backing that up.
Correct. Right.
And this is what's happening with the Gentiles.
Absolutely.
They are included, but now we are at a place where they are excluding others, with the exception of, if you do what we do, then you will be in.
And that's not they're supposed to be imitating Christ, and Jesus died on behalf of the world. Jesus died while we were yet sinners. This is the whole point of what the Gentiles were to do. They were part of modeling faith. But you know what? Paul has just previously pointed out, it's because of Israel's unbelief that Paul and Barnabas and others went to the Gentiles. So unbelief also plays a role and function in this story. And so it's not the basis of what any person does, but it's on the basis of what God has done. And I have to realize in my own life that I have days where I may be more reflective of the Spirit. I may be more reflective of faith that points to God. And I may have other days that look a lot more like the Israel in chapter 10, who was an Israel of unbelief. And instead of trying to set myself up as though I'm this special remnant that has it all right, I need to understand that each day I should be doing an introspection of my life to see the ways in which I am more like what the Gentiles were supposed to be modeling in faith, rather than what Israel was struggling with in her egocentric attempts not to move forward. That's my struggle, always my ego and the Spirit within me. So both of them play a role and function.
Okay, we got about 1 minute.
Uh-oh.
This dividing wall, as it comes down, according to Paul, there seems to be a sense of unity. What we're saying throughout this series is that all means all, and we're speaking here about this universal God identity, this battle at Rome between the Gentiles and the way they perceive their paradigms, the way they see this, and this unbelieving Jews, the way they see it, their paradigms. It is a fundamental disagreement in theology.
Yes.
And they're wrestling back and forth, and my way is the right way, and the Jews' way are the right way, and there's a battle back and forth. Paul steps in, and he says, actually, let me help both of you out. Everyone's included.
Yes.
And Gentiles, be fortunate, you are also included.
Yes.
And then, of course, it disturbs the Gentiles because he's like, oh, and by the way, these Jews don't have to do the list of things that you say do.
Right. Exactly. You can live your life however you want on the planet, and you will get the consequences and results thereof as you live your life on the planet. But the point that Paul is making is that my depth of understanding of spirit is what's going to lead to the greatest abundance of life. And that's another podcast or two in and of itself.
Yeah, and we'll talk about that next time, because I also want to talk about how some people see universalism as being problematic. So there's a couple things that we'll get into. So anyways, thanks for listening. I hope you have a great week.
Thank you for joining us today. If you have any questions or comments, please contact us at info@presence.tv. You can also visit our website at presence.tv or find us on Facebook. We look forward to hearing from you.